Hello and welcome to IHBC at COP26. Conserving buildings and places conserves our planet.
Today we're joined by Dr. Alan Forster. Alan is Associate Professor within the Royal Academy of Engineering Center of Excellence in Sustainable Urban Design, Heriot-Watt University. His research focuses on themes that investigate traditional and low-carbon building materials, building resilience to climate change, maintenance and fabric repair for historic buildings, heritage building information modeling, and construction and conservation education. He has published over 80 works and has attained research grants from an array of RC UK funding councils. He is a building surveyor by profession and has a deep interest in core technical aspects of practice, and is a fellow of the Chartered Institute of Builders, a member of the Institute of Historic Building Conservation, and is an associate member of the Royal Institution of Chartered Surveyors. Welcome, Alan. Thank you for joining us today.
Hi there. Thank you very much for having me. Very kind for the invite. Thank you. And what an introduction.
Well, I'll ask you to expand on it a bit. Could you tell us about yourself, how you got started, and why you're passionate about sustainability and conservation?
It's a strange one. It's almost like a cathartic process of, being regressed to how did you start. I would say that my sort of path to getting into building conservation and really where I am today, it's sort of non-linear, really. I left school, really didn't engage well with school, to be truthful, and I left school and I was lucky enough to land an apprenticeship. I served 6 years in my apprenticeship as a plumbing and mechanical heating engineer. So I have an implicit, and my formative years were on the craft side. So I've got an implicit appreciation of the importance of craft and good craft skills as well. So I did my apprenticeship, and then I went back to college and went and did my building surveying degree. And I think that's very much my building surveying formative foundations, again, really form a lens through which I see much of my practice. So for all, I've got a PhD in material science, and it's a funny thing that I was invited to do a PhD. It sounds all very fancy, but I remember the prof saying to us, look, we've got some funding for a PhD. And I said, well, yeah, that sounds great, and I'd be really interested in doing it. And he said, look, I'm interested in materials and technology and building conservation. I said, okay, let's try and marry those up. And I could have done any materials. That's the strange thing. You could have done anything, picked any subject, but I decided to work on limes and historic mortars. And it's funny, just that quick decision where you go, well, that seems quite interesting. Then it sets a trajectory for the rest of your career going forward. So anyway, did my PhD, but in between doing my PhD, I also did the SPAB scholarship, and that cannot be overstated in the importance to my view on building conservation, philosophical, and technical aspects of conservation as well. So after working for a few years, worked at the Lime Centre, worked for building contractors, and then I ended up taking my first academic post at Heriot-Watt, and I've been there really ever since, to be truthful.
Looking at that materials science research a little bit, I think often there's an assumption that conservation is just sort of all about using existing materials and methods. And can you tell us a little bit more about how ongoing research in materials technology impacts upon conservation philosophy and practice?
Well, it's a big question. I mean, for me, that materials, whether traditional materials, are to me the bedrock of building conservation. Every sort of fabric intervention choice that we have to make has got to be predicated on sort of materials, like for like material replacement. When I think about sort of my research or my formative thoughts really came about, we're doing the SPAB scholarship, so we would go and visit repair projects on a myriad of different forms, like, structures, whether it be building materials or different forms of. It struck me that a lot of the traditional materials were also what we would consider sort of very good in terms of their environmental credentials as well. So when I think about, not all, but a lot of them, so it could be lime mortars, for example. So you'd be going to see people working with lime, whether it be in mortars or concrete or whichever capacity. And although back in the 90s, there wasn't so much of a prevalence on or a focus on the environmental attributes of them, it just so happened that, these traditional mortars were, in the grand scheme of things, much better in terms of their environmental credentials, or moving away from materials like lime, that are still have high energy and high carbon input, in terms of the firing and the dug materials. Thinking about stuff like unfired earth materials, whether it be like cob or rammed earth or materials like that, or thatch. And I think it always struck me that there was people that we were going to see on these sites or working on these projects, these historic repair projects, that were almost seen as fringe sort of outsider builders, as it were. But actually, they are very much more coming into the fore now, and especially see if I think about rammed earth cob, very low energy material inputs. They're good. So it always struck me that there was this interplay between historic buildings and the environmental sector, which might not have necessarily been as sort of intertwined as we view them now. And I was fortunate to really be quite inspired by people that were saying, going down to Cornwall to look at earth building, or just working with thatchers, or doing repair of masonry structures and work, and then getting a better understanding of lime mortars as well, or lime technologies. It's integral really to, like I say, the interplay of good sensitive building conservation, but also managing to satisfy some of the environmental aspects as well. And if we think about materials and the importance of materials in a broader setting, when I look at modern or current environmental assessment sort of policies and strategies, fabric first is a term that's banded about, that the inherent embodied carbon or low energy that's can be produced or be reflected in a lot of our traditional materials and techniques. And it seems so obvious really when you look at materials that were sourced locally, that locally procured.
Yeah.
They're not transported great distances. The amount of energy that's gone into the production of these materials in many cases can be lower than highly refined modern materials that we utilize. It just makes perfect sense. And I was always minded of, as an undergraduate, reading Alec Clifton Taylor's patterns of English architecture or whatever it was. But it makes perfect sense, that you've got regional materials, that you utilize to create architectural forms that we all know and love, and that creates the regionality of the built environment. It creates architectural forms that are sympathetic in the natural environment or within the environment. But like I say, even by virtue of not carting the materials very far, you're reducing the sort of carbon inputs as well.
And then talking about maintenance and repair for a minute, because I know you've written about this topic, and specifically in one of your papers, I've seen you write about how historic buildings or maintenance to historic buildings can be assessed on paradigms of cost or adherence to conservation philosophy or environmental sustainability. So how do you go about synthesizing these sort of strands and trying to, how do you optimize?
I think for me, the work that I've done on maintenance, it was really predicated on, it's at the bedrock, it's the heart of building conservation. When you go back to William Morris or, pre-Morris really, and, stave off decay with daily care and all of these. But the uptake of maintenance, you can see by the waves of initiatives that come through, it's the Cinderella, area of building. It's difficult to get people to engage with even very rudimentary or basic, fundamentally important aspects of maintenance. So I was trying to look at maintenance and how we might stimulate the uptake of maintenance through looking at for maintenance through a different lens. So saying, well, okay, it's to me, it makes perfect sense that if you undertake maintenance, you get retention of historic fabric, but you also have cost savings because if you're doing, minimal intervention approaches, even basics like cleaning your gutters, it's in the longer term, it saves you a lot of money rather than having built up latent and patent defects, which cost you a great deal more over time. Now, so we have myriad sort of publications, and lectures and seminars and organizations that are specifically developed to try and move forward and get people to do these types of things. And it does. Don't get us wrong, these initiatives do work, but they're not as successful as I think any of us would really like, given the importance of maintenance as an activity. So we tried to frame maintenance in terms of with an additional element, looking at sort of embodied carbon. I think that to me, the premise is that, when I look at any historic building, I mean, I'm always impressed by the way that they are inherent survivors. We look at a building that could be 200 years old, I don't know, whatever, 300 years old. And by virtue of them being there, they're a real success story, irrespective of whether people would look at them and go, or they might be energy inefficient at this point in time measured against modern energy standards. But they have had sustained utility for hundreds and hundreds of years. They've had that function, they've morphed, they've adapted, and they're still being used. And the vast majority of the buildings themselves have been a great store or lop-up of that embodied carbon. Okay, so I was always interested in, well, how can good conservation really is about the retention of the majority of that embodied carbon that's locked up in the fabric, and keeping it there for as long as you ultimately can. It's better for the architectural sort of form, and there's more of the original building, but we've got more of the carbon locked up, and we've got that sustained utility over time. But there were always going to be difficult, and I know that it's a contentious way to frame it. That were considered hard to treat buildings. I don't know. It's a tag or an attachment to buildings which is unwelcomed. But you might be confronted with a listed building. I'm in Edinburgh, so you might have the new town in Edinburgh, and you've got a really wonderful structure where you can't really do much to. It could be in the new town. You've got wonderful sandstone, facades. You've got beautifully constructed, highly decorative internal plaster schemes. There's not much that we can really do in terms of thermal upgrading for these structures. You can insulate where you can insulate without damaging the fabric. But what I was interested in really was going, well, how can we achieve energy reduction or carbon saving in these structures where we haven't got much room to maneuver in terms of intervention? And so myself and the team came up with the concept of green maintenance, where really it was looking at small maintenance interventions. And if you looked at every single maintenance intervention that you do through a suitability of material selection, so we're already thinking, well, we're wanting materials that are sympathetic and sensitive and appropriate to the repairs that are required, ideally on a like-for-like basis. Okay, can't necessarily always satisfy that, but trying to get the best you can in terms of materials, like-for-like materials replacement. So, thinking about, we've got decisions to be made about appropriateness of materials, but we can also look at the appropriateness of the material selection through a carbon lens. So it could be, well, where we, it's almost like green supply chain. So if we look at small, it could be a replacement piece of stone. So you say, well, we've got choices to make in terms of, we might have a degraded piece of ashlar masonry. So what can we do? We can make an assessment about the condition of the ashlar masonry, and we've got a series of choices. Do we go for a lime-based plastic repair, which you can use to do sort of surface repair? Do we pin and consolidate the stone, or do we replace the natural stone? So we've got a lot of choices. When we're confronted with even quite commonly occurring sort of features or repairs that might be required in these buildings anyway. So by looking at these repairs and trying to evaluate the amount of energy as well as cost, and as well as the suitability in terms of building conservation philosophy, if we started to also build in this sort of carbon dimension, minor or relatively insignificant repairs cumulatively over the years, as these interventions go on, could make a quite considerable sort of contribution to carbon reduction strategies. So it was just place here trying to get people to think of, as you've got an opportunity to influence the appropriateness of material selection, predicated on building conservation philosophy and how you view in the technical repairs. I think it's another thing as well. I mean, when I teach undergrads, or when I teach anyone really, building conservation to me, it's not this esoteric. I think people think it is this esoteric philosophical thing, and it is a philosophy, but and there's not necessarily rights or wrongs. But what's always fascinated me is that it's the way that philosophy underpins every technical intervention that we do, every decision that we make on a micro level, to repair a bit of stone, to a macro scale where we're going to put a really quite large extension onto this historic building. Philosophy infuses and it permeates all of those ultimate decisions. If I think about green maintenance, I think green maintenance would be appropriate materials that are, that have been determined. So let's say like for like material replacement on the best available materials you can get to repair with the lowest embodied carbon you can, but that give you the greatest level of durability as well. I suppose conversely, you could say brown maintenance might be where you have high embodied carbon, hideously insensitive materials like cement mortar on, a lime-hard building. It's not appropriate, it's high energy, but it also increases the rate of degradation in the fabric because of moisture buildup or whatever. So anyway, it doesn't seem to be, it's not splitting the atom, but it's trying to get people to think of maintenance and the connectivity with carbon, and that even if you have a structure that you find it difficult to implement, like say energy reduction policies through sort of the thermal efficiency, there are things that we can do that cumulatively can be really quite significant, I would argue, in the longer term.
You've written and researched on heritage building information modeling as well. How can this and other emerging digital technologies help improve the practice of conservation, and what part do they play in leading us to lower carbon practices?
Michael, there's always going to be the core, educational core of any building conservation professional, and they'll be pretty much, I think, time on it. But when I think about the transformative changes that are going on in terms of our practice, it's the environmental dimension, which that's what we're here having a chat about. But there's also the sort of the digital aspect as well, and that they're not necessarily separate entities. We can utilize progressive, innovative digital technologies to help us conserve our buildings better, but also to reallocate and redirect limited finance that we have to better conserve these structures and to also reduce degradation of structures. So an example, when I think about work that we've been doing, laser scanning, photogrammetry, digital reality capture is commonplace in the historic built environment now. It used to be, mainly for recording and documentation processes, and that's really important. But we were interested in extracting value from digital data at the university. I work with a group at Edinburgh University called CyberBuild, and we've been doing some really fancy sort of algorithm development in both in terms of machine learning and for defects, and in terms of extracting value from this digital data. Anyway, so you laser scan the building, and everybody's laser scanning buildings these days, and that's fine, and it's really important. But we were interested in how you transcend documentation. So looking at practically what we did, we looked at automatic segmentation of rubble masonry and ashlar masonry. We would sort of scan and rescan buildings, and we would be looking and writing algorithms that would detect change over time. If you're targeting interventions, so you go out and survey a building, there's inherent subjectivity in the survey process. I would go out and survey a building, okay, and I might say, there's problems in a specific area, and another surveyor or another evaluator could go out and look at the same building, and you'd be surprised at the level of difference in what was expected, or what was a list of wants or list of requirements that was given maybe to a client. So the starting point was really extraction of value and creating a more objective starting point. So we've done work on, like I say, we laser scanned buildings, and then working with Historic Environment Scotland, we wrote algorithms that, like I say, that would segment the individual masonry units. We then wrote what called plugins. So when you interact with the point clouds, the image, the point cloud that you get, we wrote algorithms that enable you to interact in. There's a piece of software called Cloud Compare, where you could import your masonry rubble structure and by pushing plug-in button, it would automatically segment the individual stones. Now it doesn't sound that glamorous, but it gives you the ability then to individually label rubble stones or ashlar stones, and that's really the starting point for a lot of conservation operations that come after that. By virtue of having the segmented individual stones, if we could then say, well, there's 1,300 stones in that facade, but then when you know the stones and the actual positioning of the stones, you can also work out the linear meterage of mortars as well, because we then had the mortar information about the mortar. You could ask the algorithm, in essence, to identify all those areas of mortars that were cutting back and recessing. So, I could go out and survey Linlithgow Palace. It would take me an awful long time to go out and individually survey every square metre of the actual building. But with the algorithms that we were using and that we developed, it enabled the computer, for want of a better term, to highlight areas that might be problematic for the surveyor then to go and have a look at. And it's switching it around really from the surveyor and the scaffolding of works being the expensive or one of the most important areas of the conservation works. If we can redirect the money that was spent on survey operations to the repair and maintenance operations, it's ultimately got to be better for the conservation of the structure as well. I think an important thing is, and an increasingly, so there's almost a battle going on with terminology, or in my mind. There's HBM, or Heritage Building Information Modelling, but that's now morphing its sort of name into digital twin. And so when we think of digital twin's been around for donkey's years in terms of automobile industry and a lot of production sector. So a digital twin, if we think about modern architectural design, you would draw the building, obviously design the building in software packages like Revit, let's say. You would draw a model of the building, and then they would use the model to construct the building. And you could have what we call a semantically rich model. So basically you then have this picture of the building, a digital picture, and you can add layers of additional information on top of it. It's almost like the process is design the building in a digital realm, construct the building, and there's a linkage between the actual building that you've got and the model. When you're looking at historic buildings, it's almost a reverse of the process. You use the laser, you laser scan the building, then you've got to segment or separate the individual bits of the building to create a model, and then you can add additional information on. But I definitely see that the quest for this digital twin in historic buildings is going to be fundamentally important in terms of assessing like the way the sensor technologies are going. So you can embed, we'll have more and more data that's telling us about the real-time performance of historic buildings, okay? And this can be linked back to a model. So you're basically saying, look, the model, and we've scanned. Imagine if we laser scan a building, and then a year later we go and rescan the building, and we can detect that change has occurred between the first digital surveyor and the second digital surveyor. That has value in terms of us going, oh, there's a change in the digital information, and it'll either direct us towards certain works. But the amount of sensors that you can embed in structures, whether it's for movement, or whether it's for energy, or whether it's for moisture, the development at a pace, and the cost of these technologies is also decreasing. You can get really good digital reality capture from a handheld phone now. So the cost is not in the acquisition of that data. It's really in what you're going to use that data ultimately for. So yeah, I definitely see that technologies are going to help us better understand the performance and the repair and maintenance of our historic buildings going forward. And I definitely think that will lead to productivity and efficiency savings. I don't think that surveyors or evaluators or people who are working on historic buildings should be necessarily scared of these technologies. It's about resource allocation and utilizing resource allocation to different areas, getting it to where it's needed most. It's ultimately about the repair of the building or the upkeep of the building. The value added would be most certainly in getting me doing higher order tasks. rather than doing monotonous surveys of. So I think that digital twin will definitely be moving forward apace. I think that moving beyond reality capture for recording as well is definitely going to, and it is gaining traction. But we've also written machine learning algorithms that are in the early stages, again, of identifying specific defects in masonry, let's say. So you can have ashlar masonry, and you can train the algorithms to detect, let's say, you laser scan the facade of a building, and you might have ashlar, so you might have, myriad different defects that confront you. But invariably it will be loss, so you'll have erosion of materials. You might have gain on materials, so it could be corrosion of iron fixings, or it could be crusts and limestone, or so products that actually add to the stone. So you've got the image, so you've got stuff that's lost from the image, or stuff that's added to it, or you can have discoloration in material as well, like salt staining or moisture related issues as well. So we did laser scanning of, it was actually Stirling Chapel working with Historic Environment Scotland again, and the cyber build team over at Edinburgh University. We wrote algorithms to detect sort of severe directed defects. We then set the algorithm going, and it was really pretty good, surprisingly good, for it being a first wave. But we need more training data. The more data that we have to feed into the algorithm, ultimately the better it would become at detecting sort of defects with greater levels of confidence. But especially within the context of climate change, we've got increased rainfall. So if in Scotland there's a mass masonry tradition, generally speaking, there's other forms, but let's say a great deal of what confronts us pre-1919 is mass masonry. So we're getting increasing intensity of rainfall, which is saturating, or the fabric saturated for longer. Through sensor technology and real-time data attached back to a semantically rich model, we get a better understanding of the actual need to intervene, or triggering alarm bells of going, I'm really worried about the degradation in this. Also correlating that moisture in materials and energy and heat loss, the conductivity of materials change with an increase in moisture content as well. So there's an interrelationship between energy efficiency and wet buildings, really, as well as water is the engine of decay, that type of thing, as well as going, it's getting wetter for longer. Anyway, yeah, so I definitely say that these digital technologies and the information management really helping to repair in a more efficient way as we move forward.
Does your research also involve looking at what can be done for buildings as well as places and communities to increase their resiliency? You started to mention some of the sensor technology, but are you looking at this more broadly as well?
Yeah, I mean, I look at, sort of building resilience to climate change mainly through a fabric perspective. But there's also the realization or an understanding of sort of community resilience as well, and this sort of interplay between effects of fabric and then the effects ultimately on the people as well. And we've been doing some educational research projects on looking at how we can better really about sort of education provision for, community resilience affected by, by sort of severe weather events. And it can be on a national scale. If the Cumbria floods, affected a lot of traditional structures that might not be listed, but they're really important in terms of the pattern of the townscape. These buildings are flooded, people are decanted, and we have, here we haven't got that deep a pocket in the UK, but we have a great deal of resilience inherent in the system. But when I've been working with partners in Nigeria, and they have issues that are on almost a different order of magnitude as well. The premise of the work was to try to get students to better understand the connectivity between these sort of environmental catastrophic issues, or really important factors that affect communities, whether it be on fabric. And when when I'm teaching, the majority of stuff I'm trying to teach students to, it's like mitigation to flood issues, or what do we do if the buildings are flooded, and how would we technically intervene with that? But also to get them to think about the implications on wider and broader sort of community resilience as well, and that there's this interplay between the two that are fundamentally important, and how you actually contextualize that in educationally. You know, how do you develop scenarios that are sufficiently complex to simulate the world, that the professional world that they're going to inhabit? You know, the bringing together of multidisciplinary, transdisciplinary teams to look at issues that are really complicated, you know, and even there's educational value in them understanding the complexity of those issues, even if they haven't got all the solutions, just to understand these things. A lot of my formative work looking at building resilience to climate change. So I was interested in specifically in moisture related problems. So looking at structures, especially in Scotland, you know, but, you know, it could be, you know, all around the UK and across Europe, you know, buildings that were built and designed, you know, for a certain climatic, let's say, norm, and now they're having to perform under increasing performance strain that they were never necessarily designed to cope with. And how do we help these structures, you know, be more resilient ultimately? So in previous projects, I've looked at sort of infrastructural masonry. So it could be like historic masonry bridges and tenement construction where you've got mass masonry walls, and looking at the implications of increased wetting and saturation of masonry and mortars, and what happens to the physical properties of these materials over, you know, longitudinally. So how are these materials faring in terms of their performance and degradation rates over 40, 50, 60 years? And we did accelerated testing and a host of things. I think in essence, I think, you know, we're all going to have to get our thinking cap on.
You touched on it a little bit when you were talking about sort of setting scenarios as you're teaching undergrads, but I wanted to ask, what role do you see as higher education sort of research establishments in general playing in helping our society become more sustainable when it comes to the built environment?
The importance of sustainability and environmental issues, it's overwhelming, really. It pervades every aspect of almost everything that we do. And I think that you can either embed, so you can have courses or modules that are specifically orientated towards looking at sustainability in the round, and they're fine, and I'm sure they have their place. But I think really what's most important for me, and what I would like to see, would be highly contextualized sustainability education. So you try to embed the issues that you are framing in sustainability in real world scenarios. It's better for engagement of a student or as a building professional or whatever you're doing. If you can see that context that's created that has meaning, you engage with the educational process much more. I think there's also the importance of accrediting bodies, whether it be IHBC for sort of conservation related, whether it's CIOB, RICS, RIBA. They have a lot of clout to see, actually, we want to see an enhanced and bolstered, meaningful offering in terms of sustainability issues.
Well, thank you, Alan, for coming in today and talking. Very interesting. I'd like to wrap up by asking you, in your estimation, what does the future look like, or what should it look like in terms of sustainability and conservation of the built environment?
I've always seen, and I don't know whether it's just through my practice experience or my sort of worldview, I've never seen building conservation and sort of wider natural conservation as being, they're almost intertwined. I think those who, and this is a totally unsubstantiated, generalized sort of view maybe, but those who work in building conservation almost come from the same root or origin as those working in natural environment. You know, it's almost like, you know, if you put if they were working in disparate sectors and you brought them together in a room, they would be quite happy bedfellows, I would have thought. And I think, you know, going back to thinking of, and I'm not in any way expert on, you know, those who've been pioneers of, you know, natural environment conservation, but imagine Morris and Ruskin and these people would be, you know, cheek by jowl with these people in their philosophical constructs. So I see, I mean, in terms of conservation, I think we come from the same origin. You know, I firmly believe that, you know, let's say that the you know, the view of society and the view of wanting things to be better and to be conserved better, whether it's fabric and buildings or whether we want the natural environment. I'm like, we naturally inhabit that space, and I'm proud that I care about people and the built environment and wider environment. And so whilst I don't necessarily consciously think about, in that sort of like natural environment conservation, it's like it's always there. It's always like I'm on your side. I'm supportive of that. And I think in terms of how do I feel, it's one of these questions. It's a hideously difficult question. I mean, and I've been watching the news, and people have been asked similar questions about, well, are you optimistic about it? I'm like, it becomes overwhelming. It becomes overwhelming when you think about all the hideousness, all the overwhelming nightmare that is climate change. But acting individually to do little bits, cumulatively, surely we can solve the bigger bits, but it's that willingness to do our wee bit. We can always strive to do better, but we come from a strong origin of care and wanting to do the right thing.